Well, thank you all for coming today. I just need to announce, first of all, that this event is part of a series called the EU Future Series, and that is a series of conversations exploring the emerging future in Europe. And we would like to thank the EU delegation in Washington, which is helping to fund this project. Okay. Now, for this conversation, our guest is José Ignacio Torreblanca, who it is a pleasure to welcome today. He's come in from Madrid. Nacho, as we in Spain, those of us who know him well, call him for short, is a professor who teaches European integration at the Spanish Distance University in Madrid, one of the biggest universities, and I think also one of the oldest of this kind. He's also the director of the European Council for Foreign Relations in Madrid. He is best known for being a regular columnist for the newspaper El País in Spain. It's the most important newspaper in Spain. And on June 1st, he is going to be taking on the job of head editor of the opinion section of El País, which is a job that really gives you a tremendous amount of responsibility there. So we're very, very pleased to welcome Professor Torreblanca. And the way in which we're going to proceed is that we've invited Professor Torreblanca to talk about his latest book and perhaps also another book that he published not too long ago. The latest one is on the European Union and is titled Who Governs Europe? But he's also written a book not very long ago on the new party in Spain, Podemos. Those of you who followed events in Spain know that in the last elections last fall, two new parties have emerged in Spain and have broken the mold of kind of bi-party, two-party plus politics in Spain. It's quite a dramatic development, and so he may also be touching on that. In fact, the picture on the brochure, I believe, is a reference to Podemos. Yes. Very good. So, José Ignacio, in your book, Who Rules Europe, you say that the prolonged crisis in Europe, which has lasted longer and has been more profound than the crisis in the United States, that this has really brought the question at the core of democratic theory to the front of who governs Europe. And you argue that there's been a failure of democracy in Europe, both at several different levels, in several different ways, and at several different levels. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
With pleasure. So thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a fantastic sunny day. Thanks for being here rather than outside, taking advantage of this. Well, the title of the book, of course, was a homage to Robert Dahl's book on Who Governs, because as a student he asked himself this question, who governs in America, and he went out to New Haven to find out, to test theories about pluralism, elitism, and he found out, very important things. First of all, that you don't need maybe a lot of research money to do a good PhD, because you can, when you do politics, you can just cross the street and make a seminal contribution to political science worldwide with very little money, other than even by walking. And in a sense, his question dealt with the nature of American political system. Is it America a democracy as it is preached, or is it ruled by very few, and therefore it's an aristocracy, or is in the hands of lobbies or interest groups and so on, So I thought, not because I wanted to compare me with Robert Dahl, but I thought this was a good starting point for approaching the European Union after the crisis, because we had never asked ourselves that question about Europe. We didn't really care about who was in charge. Usually because when things work well, you don't care how they work, you know. If your fridge cools your Coke, you know, you don't care about thermodynamic laws or something like that, right? You don't need how your car, you know, it's only when your car is broken and then they want to charge you an extraordinary amount of money, and then you start figuring, oh, no, what? I want to understand. I want to know what went wrong, you know, who designed this, who's responsible for this, is it someone that fixed it in the wrong way, whatever. I think citizens in Europe, with respect to European Union, we have had something of a similar experience. We didn't care much about Europe. Europe worked well. It delivered. For many years, it created goods and distribute them across different countries, the single market the most prominent, but also the free circulation of people, capital. Services were a bit more problematic, but in general terms, everyone was happy. It was also, there was also convergence between North and South, so poorer countries like Spain were catching up with richer countries, but richer countries weren't feeling threatened by this, because at the same time they were exporting. So it was a win-win game. In which there were no heavy issues related with distribution, left-right, was absent of competition, and the same north-south or center-periphery. But it came to a moment throughout in the crisis that we entered in a very damaging relationship. All these cleavages started to appear, center-periphery, north-south, Catholics and Protestants, rich and poor, debtor and creditor. So it was a sort of all this bad blood was again on the table, and Europe was not delivering. There wasn't growth, there wasn't, of course, jobs, and in some countries like in Spain, but also more particularly in Greece, Ireland and Portugal, countries were intervening. Something which we never thought that would happen, you know, things, of course, you read in the papers about third world countries being intervened by IMF, you know, and dictated policies, and governments being replaced, democratically elected governments being replaced by technocrats, by people who are in charge and who are above politics because they know how to deal with economic crisis. Now, all these questions have come up during the crisis, and people started to develop a feeling of uneasiness about the EU. You know, did I elect these guys? Who are they? How can I get rid of them? You know, what is the use of European elections? Why do I go? In the past, you would go and vote for mostly symbolic reasons, right? You know, I feel pro-Europe and I like this to work, so therefore I vote for a party. But elections are about choosing and about punishing as well, right? So if you cannot get rid of your government, why would you bother going voting? Or if your representative does not represent you, why would you care about this? So all these questions came up, and the funny thing, you know, that I had been teaching the political system of the European Union for a decade. And I had to write a book with the question, who governs Europe, because I didn't know, and I was teaching that, you know, and some students said, look, you know, you should know, prof. You're teaching this subject matter and you don't know who's in charge. That's a problem. I said, yes, this is a problem. You know, this is a problem for all of us. It's not only the problem for the university who hired me and for you who pay for listening to someone who doesn't know enough about this, but it's a problem for all of us. Because if we don't know who's in charge, then we cannot change policies, and then, you know, fringe parties would come up, and so on. So, to try to close this first round, we started then looking at standard theories of democracy to try to find out, you know, what was wrong, and how is it, and what can we do about it. And we figured it out that, as you know, democracy has existed at the city level, you know, the polis in Greece, and many of the experiences we still have with the direct or democracy are still, you know, related to the experiences of Greek democracy. Then, you know, they were like almost like 100 or more, 1,000 years before we started experimenting with another forms of democracy, and we ended up with nation states. And now we have supranational democracy. The European Union member states have stopped being nation states. They're not nation states anymore. They don't have fiscal policy. They don't have monetary policy. They have we are under the supremacy of EU law. EU law is automatically binding and effective in our countries and overrules domestic legislation. So the understanding of sovereignty, typical of a nation state and democracy, has to change. But we don't have a model for what a supranational democracy should look like. People say, look at Star Wars. Is the Federation, is the Republic? Is that a functional and viable political system for supranational democracy? The European Union is a bit like that. It's a dysfunctional supranational democracy. And the problem is that we've never done this before. We've never done a supranational democracy before. We don't have a model. You cannot download if you create a state, if Boston succeeds and you create a nation state, you can download a ready sort of to use model of democracy, a representative democracy, liberal democracy. If you download it in the wrong places, we know it's not going to work. But you probably download it here and it would work. You know what to do. But when you are trying to do this thing, which is European Union, you don't have the model. You have to experiment. And you make mistakes along the way, and you have to correct them. And you need to correct them both technocratically, but also democratically, because you cannot leave people out. And so far, the dominant mode of legitimation of the European Union has been by results, has been output. If it works, then it's okay, and this is what we call the permissive consensus. People largely didn't care because it was okay. But then when things don't work, you have to legitimize them in different ways, by procedures, by being able to insert democratic procedures into this. You may take a vote in this class to do something, and you may end up in the minority and being forced to do a thing you didn't want to do, but you will respect the process. If the process was okay, you would abide even if you are in the minority. So that's a way by which decisions are democratic. Even if you don't benefit from them, you accept them, right? So this is the procedural side of democracy. And we don't have much of that at the European Union level. It's not democratic in that way. I cannot accept having lost an election because there wasn't an election that I lost. And therefore I'm ruled by someone who is not entirely a winner or a loser, is something in between. And the other dimension under which legitimacy works, as you know, is identity. My country, right or wrong. You accept decisions just because they were taken in the name of something you feel part of. And people ultimately even they sacrifice their lives for nations, because they feel they identify with that. The marginal utility in an economic model of dying for your country is zero, right? You don't benefit for that. It's not you cannot find a rational explanation of utility maximization of dying for your country. You do it for a different reason, because you feel part of something larger. The European Union is not a nation, it's not a state, it's not a democracy. So how can you legitimize? How can you bring citizens into this process so they can give their consent? And ultimately, democracy is government by consent, not only by majority rule. So this is the place where we are in terms of trying to experiment and suffer through a mode of functioning of European politics that has probably collapsed or exhausted. It's been okay to take us here, but now something else has to come in and a different panorama opens. And this is where we are pretty lost as to what to do and how to do it.
So thank you for that initial exposition. In your book, you talk about various kinds of cleavages emerging in the European Union. You talk about the North-South, which coincides largely with the creditors versus debtor state division in the Eurozone. You talk about the East-West, which I think has become more evident, perhaps in foreign policy, but also in particular, more recently in relation to the migrant, or rather refugee crisis. So far, and I think this is what you were thinking of when you were writing the book, the people that have been dictated to or intervened are the debtor states in the Eurozone. And some people have been proposing that the way to move forward on this is to actually have a kind of Euro chamber, which would be a subsection representing a subsection of the EU, and that this Euro chamber would then in some way or other control a European executive that would be accountable to it, but that would also have more powers of a fiscal nature. I wonder what you think about these proposals.
Yeah, there's a roadmap for completing monetary union with all the sort of right institutions that we need to make it function. As we all know, monetary union, we were having yesterday this discussion, monetary union was not designed by economists in the first place. There was a political motivation behind that. It was German reunification, it was the decision to try to exchange German reunification, how difficult that was for France, but for other countries, in return for having more control over Germany and for completing a political union. It hasn't quite worked that well, it's sort of the karate move in which you try to hit someone and then, they take advantage of your strength and then you end up in the floor. And this is probably what has happened to France in the sense that they wanted to control Germany with the euro. And, Germany has ended up controlling everyone. So all this impulse behind monetary union was ultimately political. And no one was aware of the consequences of starting this process, the problems that you would find. But people thought they were very optimistic that, well, we'll fix it. We'll fix these problems as they come. The European Union works on a crisis mode. Crises have always been sort of good because they provided the stimulus to go on, and you could always find great deals or package deals which would expand things. The problem that we have now is that we are in a sort of a middle of nowhere. We've left, sort of the safe land of nation states, but they are too far away. There's some people that want to go back to them, right? You have right-wing movements, parties, populist, what we call them, Europhobes, that say, look, this is a mistake, I'm going back, The promised land does not exist. We've been for 50 years going in circles, we've damaged each other, we've destroyed democracy. Let's go back. Let's go back to our national currencies, our national borders, our national identities. It's like Moses, going at some point facing the rebellion of people saying, look, this is not realistic, we're not going to cross this sea. It's not going to open, and so on, And it's an act of faith in a sense, because as I said, we don't have a model. It's a leap forward into the unknown, just on the understanding that what we're leaving behind is first not viable anymore, and it's not desirable because we know how it ended up. Time and again, the long civil war started in 1870, finished in 1945. Europeans managed to turn our civil wars into world wars and export a sizable, number of conflicts and to other places. So we know now what should be done, to complete monetary union and to fix the problems that are harming and are creating these cleavages and these tensions. We need more centralized government and more centralized institutions. But we cannot do it through agencies. The European Central Bank is, at the moment, the only true supranational, even federal institution that we have in the European Union. The ECJ, the European Court of Justice, is also a federal institution. And by the way, they adopted an American model of integration because, as you know, European systems of law don't work on a case law basis like the US system. The discretionality of judges across the continent is much smaller than in the US. But of course, if you are a judge in a Supreme Court, it's much better to model along the US Supreme Court than according to a continental model. So in the past it was ECJ that was pushing integration. Now it's the European Central Bank. But this is very contested. Are these institutions able to take decisions which affect countries in different ways? We have now a problem because inflation is too low. It doesn't come up to the average goal of 2%. There is deflation in Spain, which is very bad for debtor countries and also for growth and jobs. But you would need 4% inflation in Germany in order to have an average inflation of close to 2%. If you have 4% inflation in Germany, that country, would leave the European Union. It would not expel anyone. They would automatically leave if you impose such a rate of inflation. So we know that we need more centralized government. We know we need a treasury. We know we need a finance minister, and we need to know we need more economic government. But the way we do this, with all these sometimes very confusing words like governance, which is something very puzzling for citizens, and even for academics, like governance is defined as government without government, which is a very democratic contradiction in terms. So how do we know? You can look at this report by the 5 presidents, the president of the council, the commission, the parliament, the ECB, and the ECJ, and there is a very clear roadmap. But it's funny because the first bit is like 7 pages, the first bit is about how to make a monetary union work. And then technically we more or less know what to do. We know what hasn't worked well, and we know how to fix it. You need more Eurobonds, you need banks which are funds able to bail banks out when it comes to, and then you need fiscal policy, all these things. But these documents rings as it moves on, because when you start talking about labor markets, pensions, living conditions, welfare systems, then we don't know how to do this. How far should you harmonize? And then ultimately, there is just like at the end a paragraph, and then we will have to discuss the political institutions and how to legitimize all this, which is sort of the, you're leaving the Federalist paper for the last minute, rather than, you first have a discussion of what you want, and then the other institutions follow. And this is why it is so damaging, because all these intermediate experiments with governance, they end up leaving you in sort of the worst of both worlds. The European Commission, and we tried to have this model as a government. We decided that for the first time in the last European elections, people would choose. People would know who the candidates were. So, you have the main political parties fielding candidates for the post of President of the Commission. But at the end, the President of the Commission is halfway an elected politician and a halfway president of an agency which is independent and is in charge of making sure that the rules are met. And this is a nightmare for the institution and for those working for that, because you're just changing your heart from a technocratic, impassionate body in charge of applying the rules with objectivity to all partners, and then you're supposed to be left or right when it comes to applying this or that policy and have political. So someone has described the European Commission as a sort of in the worst of these two worlds, as a politicized bureaucracy, which is the worst that you can have, or a helpless government, So you're not quite meeting any of the results. For example, see on this refugee crisis, that the Commission is helpless or powerless. It is, all power is in the Council. At the end, when push comes to shove, when there is a crisis, the true legitimacy sits with the heads of government, because these are democratically elected people that would be answerable for big failures to the people. And they meet in this sort of crisis mode now almost every week or every 2 weeks, and they take decisions which are ultimately very political. They create legal effects, and then they have to be ratified by the Commission, the Parliament, and they may even imply treaty change. Like, for example, the offer they made to Britain to stay in. It's an offer which steps out of all formalities or treaties and so on. They have the legitimacy to do it, but then you would have to change everything. So the Commission ends up not being a government. They say sometimes the Commission, and very, they don't treat the presidents of the Commission with a lot of respect in the European Council. They sometimes ask them to leave when they're going to discuss important matters related with foreign policy. Say, why don't you leave the room? This is foreign policy. This is serious, and they end up telling, I think Romano Prodi complained that someone from the council summarized this by telling him, look, you're a travel agent, we decide where to go, and you book the flights and make sure that there is a hotel, and but you're just we are in charge.
This is to the president of the Commission.
To the president of the Commission, yeah. So you are a travel agent. You don't decide where we go. We decide where we go, and then you take care of the logistics of doing this, So this clash of power, if you have a finance minister at the EU, like the ECOFIN, Varoufakis had this, for all the difficulties and how difficult the character is, he has this very good line in which he discovers that the ECOFIN is meeting in secret without him because they are sick and tired of him. They are sick and tired of him lecturing them and confronting all of them, so they meet in secret. They continue, or they say the meeting has to stop, but then he figures out, like, when you're invited to a party, the party's over, but you find out that they're still partying. So then he protests, and he says, look, you're meeting without me. And they say, we're not meeting, this institution does not exist. So you cannot complain of being excluded of the Eurogroup meeting, which does not exist. It's just a function as
blanket denial.
Yeah,
essentially.
But this is how it works. So if you had a finance minister and throughout the Euro crisis imposing austerity, dictating bailout packages on countries, you would have to elect this person or submit him or her to election every 4 years. You should have a program. But the problems with accountability in the Euro crisis have been huge. Even the European Parliament has been marginalized. The IMF walked away because they didn't even understand what they were doing. Officials in the ECB, in the European Central Bank, they said, I don't want to go anymore to Greece because we are overstepping our mandate. I'm just a technocratic body, but we are telling the Greeks whether they should cut in here or there, in pensions, or in medicines and so on, and everyone felt uneasy about this. So this is why the Greek crisis was a total chaos.
So I wonder, it seems like politics then is still very much decentralized. Politics is still very much local, but EU leaders are trying to make decisions for the Eurogroup, or rather for the EU, in fact, in this decentralized way. I wonder if we could move a little bit from the EU to your country and to what has happened at the national level, the kind of political consequences for national democracy that have emerged. You said yesterday at a different meeting that one of the interesting things is that we see more xenophobia in the countries that have in some sense suffered the least, and that have also seen less migration and less, or at least many fewer refugees actually arriving on their shores, and that you have the contradiction of the countries that have suffered the heaviest from the economic crisis actually having to take care of refugees, with Greece, of course, being the most extreme example of this. Now, in Spain, the way things have worked is that people have not just been blaming the EU or have not really been focusing as much on the way in which the EU is responsible for what has happened, but have been blaming their own politicians and we have two new parties that have been saying, in essence, the principal problem is with our political elite. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this phenomenon.
Okay.
And what do you think about it?
There are two things there. One is that at the beginning of the crisis, when we started looking at how unemployment figures and social inequalities were rising throughout southern but also peripheral countries, like Ireland is not exactly southern Europe, but for different purposes, it fits into this. People thought that democracies or democratic systems were going to follow along the path of the 30s in the last century, in which you would expect people losing affection for democracy and trying to find alternatives to democracy, whether communism, fascism, and so forth and so on. And then sitting in Madrid and having to deal with foreign press and correspondence throughout the crisis, I remember that it was very funny, because all of them coming to Madrid would ask you, why is not anything happening here? This is, I do my job, I get my briefing before I come to Madrid, and I see that you guys have 26% unemployment, more than, half of those who are unemployed had been unemployed for more than 2 years and they lost their subsidies. There's a 50% youth unemployment. University fees have gone up while people cannot find decent occupations. People are losing their homes. There are massive evictions because Spanish law does not allow you just to to return your property. The people even committing suicide because they've been evicted from Spain. Is a very extraordinary place in that 80% are homeowners. And there's a culture of home owning, and this is your biggest investment in your lifetime. So, so when you lose that, that's your your main financial asset, and so on. So people were looking at all these figures, and they said, why is nothing happening? This is
politics.
In politics, And then we had May and the Indignados, people taking to the streets. It started through the anti-evictions movement, which was very important because the feeling of social injustice at the time in which banks, which had been giving money like crazy to people had 120% mortgages, mortgages for more than the value of the property they were acquiring. So, you would walk into to a bank branch and they would give you a home, but also a cruise and a car and a holiday, whatever, just borrow, it's so easy, you will return and then you lose everything. So banks were being bailed out, while people were not being bailed out, And then you have, this thing with the Indignados started mounting, and then some people say, look, yes, this is it, But one funny thing about Indignados, and I remember having these discussions, was that even if it was young and, in the outlook almost revolutionary in terms of, demanding direct democracy and different forms of participation, at the end, most of the people who were demonstrating and who went out to the streets in solidarity with these people were just demanding representative democracy, which worked. And the slogan in Puerta del Sol was "No nos representan," they don't represent us, which is a claim about representative democracy. Is I want representative democracy to work. I don't want to get rid of the system. I want the system to work, which is a different thing. So, for societies which throughout the crisis have been very demobilized, there was like cheap money, lots of jobs, and so forth and so on. People had, especially young, have left politics. You would, throughout the crisis, try to get your piece, or sometimes in a paper, or try to engage in a discussion about politics, and it was not interesting to people. But across Southern Europe, you see a spike in interest in politics and repoliticization of people, and the emergence of groups, platforms, movements, which is being very healthy. So instead of, having marginal or anti-democratic movements or right-wing authoritarian because in part Spain, and as other countries, has been vaccinated, by the Franco regime on right wing and die-hard nationalism and all these things. But you started having very fresh and very new movements which wanted different things. So this is something which is very positive about the crisis, that has brought back people into politics rather than alienating people and expelling them. And these people have mobilized, they created political parties. The two main leaders of the new parties were born in 78, the year which the constitution was approved. They have sort of a clean record, and they, they're young, and they connect very well, of course, with the new generations. Then on the immigration thing, it's funny because, as you said, if you try to draw a correlation between xenophobia and jobs or unemployment, it works the other way around. It's in Switzerland where where xenophobic parties, where you have full employment, where xenophobic parties are on the rise. When you look at Britain and unemployment figures in Britain, it's amazing. They have the highest what is la tasa de ocupación?
Employment rate.
The highest employment rate in history. People are occupied, and then they have one of the lowest unemployment figures across the continent. And this is the place where you have anti-immigration platforms. The same with Scandinavia and the Netherlands and all these countries. Whereas in countries such as Spain, that they got immigrants for the last 10 years in large numbers, we have the same numbers of Bulgarians and Romanians than the Brits, for example. And there is a xenophobic party in Spain. Why? Because people first, they have the experience of the past where their grandparents emigrated. So every family has a history of immigration. That those who emigrated, they were hard workers, they were looking for a better future. They were not like welfare abusers. Even if Germany was a welfare state in the 60s, people didn't go there to abuse the system, but to get a job, save money, come back and educate your children. So all families have these experiences. Then we've had the experience of immigration in the good years of the crisis, and mainly because they came from mostly Latin America. They integrated well, they haven't been, no ghettos have been created, there are not crime issues. So it has worked quite well. And now Spaniards are immigrating themselves. So, you go to London and it's impossible to buy a coffee in English, because there are Spanish waiters around the place in all Costa cafes and so on. So we have a relationship with immigration which is much more, I would say, natural, close, and it's practically, and I think you see that empirically in polls, it's across Europe. There are those who don't have immigrants, like in rural areas and so on, who are mostly anti-immigrants because they fear them coming. They don't see them in. Once they're in, people see, for example, in London. London is not a xenophobic city, because people see them in, they integrate, that's okay, it's precisely where you don't have them. So this is how these attitudes are transformed, and it's very revealing of how I think Southern European societies have matured in senses which we probably didn't expect. But on the refugee crisis is a different point, and maybe we can discuss it if you want, but it's a completely different story.
Right, the refugee crisis is still relatively recent, so we perhaps are not seeing the full effect. I want to see if anyone would like to participate at this point. So from this point on, if someone would like to ask a question about a particular point, I would say the floor is open. So before I go on, yes, Vivian Schmidt.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for this great intervention and discussion. And so I just want to ask you a bit more about the current governmental situation in Spain, and where Podemos stands, and how you see Podemos in terms of how it relates to power, and the problems, I would say, from going from a social movement to a governing party.
Yeah, well, I think this is one great political experiment that Syriza to a certain extent is similar to it, but there are things in Podemos which are truly autochthonous, indigenous. The way they've been theorizing. I mean, first of all, Podemos is a party of political science professors, which
Scary.
is really scary.
Fantastic.
Depends
So-
on who you think
a
of.
party of economists. I think.
Yeah. So it's funny because, you know, I was like, if you dissect what they are, it's like the five at the top, they sort of, each and every one of them, they bring like different superpowers of political scientists into this. So they make a very perfect combination, you know, like the leader, Pablo Iglesias, is good on TV. He's you know, this party started in a TV show because, you know, they were very obsessed with how TV has changed political competition. And they say that something like TV is to contemporary politics to what powder was to the Middle Ages. You know, with TV you can bring down the castles of the guys that have established themselves and have entrenched it. So, you know, the Middle Age worked because there weren't canyons, right?
Cannons,
so,
yeah.
Cannons,
Yeah.
not canyons, sorry, cannons. So, you know, these people could spend lots of time and create social structures which were very heavy, very hierarchical, very vertical. You know, you would just walk into the castle and wait for the barbarians to come, and you could just very easily defeat them, you know. But then TV does it, and social media together, you can do it because it's cheaper and you can test messages. You don't need to run grassroots organizations. So Pablo Iglesias was very well aware of the fact that if it didn't work in TV, it wouldn't work in reality. So this is why he started.
Experiment.
Yeah, you know, this is why he started creating this platform. He started with a TV show, La Tuerca, tried to crowdfund it. It didn't work, but it helped him understand that, yeah, you can be a political science professor, but if you talk as one, you're lost. You know, you get 10 votes, right? So political communication was very important. And then they had also very good people looking at polls and trying to understand how Spanish society had changed other than deeply down, other than just look at polling intentions. And the mistake traditional pollsters made during the European elections is that they were doing traditional polls. They were not trying to understand the underlying currents, how society had been changing, how these new understandings of democracy, sovereignty, social rights had changed. So they had this lady, Carolina Vescanza, a very good pollster, doing focus groups, which pollsters were not doing anymore, trying to understand what really mobilized people, and figuring out that left-right did not matter much anymore because people were basically fed up and they wanted sort of new things. They had then the second to the party, Íñigo Errejón, who is sort of the engine because he did his PhD on Bolivia and Morales and how to mobilize people who are always outside the system, how to bring in denizens, or in the case of Bolivia it's pretty obvious, you know, because, you know, in Bolivia you had always like a right and a left party, both from the elites in power, but, you know, because indigenous people and the locals would never vote, you know, so they never won elections even if they were more, because they never organized themselves around these questions, you know. And this is something, this attempt to bring La Clau and populism into Europe, this is something which Íñigo Errejón has theorized a lot. You know that populism is something which the left wing has never been easy with, nationalism, populism. But for the guys in, you know, for the guys in Podemos, because they were very closely associated with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, they found out that the left could not ignore the very powerful effects of mobilizing people around the idea of nation and identity. This is something which the left has always been very uncomfortable with, like flags and nations and identity, typically right-wing populism, you know, church, authority, fatherhood, whatever, all these things. But in Latin America in the 90s, people started to experiment with different understandings of nation, and the left was very successful in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and whatever you define as success is you know, this is a discussion, but electorally. And these people at some point say, look, you know, we can win elections. The far left does not need to become revolutionary. We don't need to throw the system. We can just win elections. The Castros, they make this very, I think, good criticism on Castro brothers. How could they not win an election? Because of course they don't believe in elections, but if you cannot win an election in Cuba, where can you win an election? You control the state apparatus, you control everything, the opposition is outside the country and so on, So they discovered electoral democracy. And they decided that they could play that game and win it. And the only experience across Europe that had been close to that was the Italian Communist Party, which is something Pablo Iglesias did his PhD on, because he was in Bologna as a student. So the Italian Communist Party was the only party which was populist in the sort of good sense of the word. It was a party that could stretch out to peasants in the south of Italy, who, according to Marxist theory, were totally useless, and mobilize them around a feeling of belonging and identity and class, so it was a popular party, a populist party in the good sense. So Podemos is a unique experiment in trying to bring, and this is sometimes the discussion, not the Venezuelan model into Europe, though, for example, Juan Carlos Monedero, another one of the top guys, he was very closely involved with Chavez, and probably he's one of the theorists of the socialism of the 21st century, and so his ideas are more outlandish or more radical and less democratic, I would say. But Errejón and all these people, they're trying to understand the mobilizing force of feelings of identity from the left, with Chantal Mouffe and Ernest Laclau and all that. And I think they're very successful. So they've combined political theories that are very new in Europe or in local contexts with techniques which are also new. Campaigning on Twitter, Facebook, because they didn't have the money, they were smarter, they didn't need to go to banks or to accept, to have slush funds or even corruption, because campaigning on the internet is cheaper and you can do it like with crowdfunding, though there was some money associated from Iran and Venezuela in some of these TV shows, which is problematic at the beginning, but I think they are a very good combination of these two things, unique techniques and different theories, and this is why they're so interesting, which allows them to be in a position to do something very similar to what Syriza did in Greece to the PASOK. There you have the old social democrats who've been throughout the crisis applying neoliberal policies and are totally discredited, especially among the young people, because they protect more the people on pension than young people. So this is what is unique in Spain, that compared, for example, to Portugal or even to Italy, there is a new force from the far left that thinks it's in a position to challenge a traditional social democratic party and probably kill it or force it to irrelevance. This is what they think, and this is why they've been uncompromising since December 20th, because they felt that the music had stopped too early, that they were having a great time in elections. While elections play bad for established parties because the castle, is going down, they have a great time. Every time they go to an election, they do well, and therefore when the music stopped on the 20th, they were just so close to the social democrats, to the socialists, that they don't have an incentive to, now I support them, I enter into government, I become a pragmatist, and then, let's push it a bit more.
So is that why they're not agreeing?
This is what they don't agree. They don't want to give life. Yeah, they don't want to resuscitate the social democrats by bringing them into power. Because they see them that they are about to die, and they say, well, let's just let's follow the natural course and wait for the next election to see whether we surpass them. And then there would be a two-party system in Spain, in a sense that there would be the conservatives, maybe with the liberals, and them. They're very good at polarization. And this is something we know across the US, but also European politics, that in the past, politics was about the median voter. There was this smart voter in the middle who would compare electoral platforms and which would decide whether they would switch their vote from one election to the other, depending on, if you polarize politics, then, the median voter disappears or is irrelevant, and therefore, you can choose either conservative or left-wing, and there's nothing in the middle. And this is a game they play very well. They're very good at that. So this is why polarization and the moment through which we're going in Spain is two parties in the middle which are reasonable, pragmatic, but are too small even to be in power together. And then temptations by parties which are at the extremes to continue the game, to see whether they can destroy these two parties and reabsorb them into larger units. This is how I would characterize the Spanish situation. Sorry, that was too long.
No, that's fine. That's fine. If you have a question, give me a sign, okay? So I don't go on with my own questions. It seems like there is. Yes, Lefteris. Yes.
Talked about the relationship between.
Stand up and speak up.
Sorry.
You talked about the relationship between Syriza and Podemos. Do you believe that the election of Syriza into power and the fact that they caved into EU demands and Greece was near bankruptcy and getting out of the EU was a good lesson for the Podemos of what they cannot do, and like becoming a bit more moderate and pragmatic, as you said?
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, there's a lesson for them in the sense that you can have. Pablo Iglesias has written this article and this interview in New Left Review in May last year, and he gives a very good account of his reading of the Greek situation, and the reading was not that Syriza made any mistakes, but that they were just too small and that Greece was too small and they were powerless to challenge the system. But they somehow think that because Spain is larger and it's a more influential country, once you challenge the system from Spain, then ECOFIN ministers and the rest of the countries, they would have to sit down. So when you go on debt renegotiation, and that you probably would find more sympathies from Italy and France. I think they're wrong in a sense, or I wouldn't want to run the experiment, to see whether they're right or wrong. But the reading was that was not that there was anything wrong in their strategy. They are very skeptical about European integration as it stands, and therefore they are not going to very easily compromise. In fact, the platform they presented to this last election included a fiscal expansion of 9 points, which is suicide under the current circumstances. When we are not, we're trying to go to 3% GDP, deficit to GDP. We're not meeting those targets. We are in the spotlight from Brussels because deficit doesn't come down. And there you have Podemos saying, no, the way to fix this is to go for a large fiscal expansion because that will create growth and so on. But in the meantime, you have to finance 1 trillion debt in the financial markets with guys, coming from ideologically from the far left and so on. So, maybe the conservatives could do a fiscal expansion and get away with it, but it's very hard to see that they could. So their understanding of financial markets and the economy is still very, I would say, dogmatic in terms of theories of capitalism or how financial markets work and so on. And at the end, they're very, they wouldn't hesitate to enter into collision course with the EU institutions because, and this has to do with the experience in in Venezuela and in Ecuador and in Bolivia because of the theories of Chantal Mouffe and all the new theories of conflict. Conflict plays an important role in politics, and therefore you should use it. And conflict is good. I would, just to summarize them, like simplify and exaggerate, okay? Like the economists. The Economist, the journal, the paper says. So, conflict is good. It helps people stay close to you. You polarize, If consensual societies are not only boring, but allow for
demobilization.
Yeah, demobilization, and then people changing from one party to the other, but the right amount of conflict. If you, and this is the same in Catalonia, for example, with the issue of if there is a question which is only binary, politics is like, from 0 to 100, we can split the difference on any issue, right? If you want more intervention in the market, I want less intervention in the market. We can settle, depending on the relative power. We can go for 40, or we can go for 60, we can go for 80, or we can go for 20. This is how political negotiations usually work. But if I get rid of that and I say, are you in favor or against, state intervention? This is yes, no. I automatically divide everyone in two, and there are no intermediate spaces. So part of the strategies, and I think they learned this from the far right on moral issues. Moral issues are typically non-divisive. You cannot distribute moral issues. Either gay marriage is a right or it isn't. You cannot just put this into a continuum and negotiate it and split the difference, right? And this understanding of politics in terms of confrontation, I'm trying also to bring the economy under these moral, markets are bad or are good, and therefore everything follows. You don't negotiate with evil entities,
Does anybody else have a question right now? Okay. So I have another question. So what you've been telling us is that identity in this phase of governmental dysfunction, in which the EU does not have the institutions to really address the crisis in a way that looks at the whole, or at least the Eurozone. That in this phase, identity has become very important, and that Podemos has kind of figured this out and doesn't want to leave that to the far right. Now, we've also seen another phenomenon in this period, which is the surge in the popularity of micro-identities. So we've had the referendum on Scottish independence, in which the Scots voted against independence. We have a very strong movement in Catalonia in Spain, also focusing on independence during this period of economic crisis. And I wonder what that means for Podemos. So it's one thing to say, okay, we need to combine somehow the agenda of the interest of the majority with identitarian appeals. And their appeal is typically to the people versus the elites. What does it mean for Podemos that there are parts of Spain where there are people pushing a definition of the people which is a subsection of the Spanish people, the Catalan people, and we see it also in other regions, perhaps in less virulent way.
That's quite interesting, because as we were discussing yesterday, answers given by the people to the very same crisis are totally different. Some people have decided that problems, the culprit is markets, and therefore they go left-wing, and you have to bring markets under control. Globalization has gone loose. Banks are in charge, so therefore I sort of take that line. Some others, like Ciudadanos, but also I said like Beppe Grillo in Italy, they say no, it's not the economy, it's politicians that are the problem. They've created this mess. Hasn't anything to do with market economies. and so on is because they interfere too much, and because they are not controlled, and because they are corrupted or ideological or just ignorance, and they mismanage the economy, right? So let's get rid of them, or get the best of them, or renovate them, and so on. No? So this is another reply typical of the crisis. And then some people think that the problem is sort of the unit, the state. It is the level of government where people are making decisions. So the problem is that decisions are not taken at the right level, right? Some people say the problem is that decisions are taken in Brussels. Let's bring decisions back to Paris or to London or to Madrid. But also people may say, like in Catalonia, no, the problem is that decisions are being taken in Madrid. Let's bring them back to Catalonia. And where you have movements or identities which were already contested or had political representation, like in Catalonia, this has been very attractive because there was a narrative, pre-existing narrative of first, oppression in the past, dictatorship and everything, though, this had substantially changed, of course, throughout democracy and the degree of autonomy which Catalonia has had since 1978 is not only unprecedented in Spanish history, but also in comparative terms across Europe, and we largely thought that the issue had been more or less settled along all these dimensions, and also because European integration would play well. Why should you bother in putting up a fight with the Spanish state if at the end of the day they don't even run monetary policy, fiscal policy, and we're all part of the European Union and so forth. So this was a win-win game. But then with the crisis, successionists were there, but they were in the numbers of 20%, more or less stable throughout all these years. There was this memory and this group, mostly left-wing successionists, whereas right-wing, they were more conservative and they were more in favor of autonomy. The problem is that center-right in Catalonia, they had to deal with austerity. They had to impose very severe cuts in health and education because the way the Spanish system is funded, regional governments, they are the face which citizens see in terms of health and education, which is the thing which people care most. You win or lose elections around universal health and the quality of public services. The same with education, because all these competences are transferred to governments, but they don't have the money to fund these services, therefore they have to cut these services. People become angry, they revolt, and so on, So, and then there was a combination also of political scandals related with corruption, with parties in power for too long and being largely unaccountable. So, for the center-right in Catalonia, suddenly it's like somehow in Bavaria, in Germany, you have this question which is always there. It's a safety valve in a sense, when Bavarians are happy Germans all the time, because they benefit a lot, they're richer than the average, right? And they do quite well. But at times of crisis, when problems come, they always raise the Bavarian sort of flag, and there is a revival of identity and feelings of, we contribute too much to the budget, we get too little, and we are exploited and so on. So it's the same in northern Italy, though this had its moment when Bossi and all these people, they declare independence. So the Catalan secessionist movement has been where it came from very traditional independence and traditions, but it found new reasons more closely, I would say, along the Padanian or the Bavarian. I would say they're even similar to the Scottish, but having to do with transfers and so on. In Scotland, I think it's a bit different, but I think this is more or less the case. And it has played well for them to contain pressures, but at the same time, it's not been very successful because they managed at the end to more or less destroy their own party. And as it has happened, for example, once you adopt a position on these very defining issues, hard issues like immigration or Europe or nationalism, you have to be very careful, because once the agenda is set on these issues, there is always someone who can outperform you on those issues. Like this is, for example, when Sarkozy in France, center-right starts adopting part of the agenda of Front National anti-immigration, or when Cameron in Britain starts adopting the agenda of UKIP anti-Europe. You know, it's all fine for a while, but at the end voters may say, look, if I'm truly anti-Europe, who is going to not compromise on this? Farage or Cameron? Cameron is going to compromise at the end. We know that. And the same with the center-right in Catalonia. They didn't wholly and fully believe in independence. For them it was if we call for independence, we will bring the state into a negotiation out of which we will extract more fiscal autonomy. This was sort of the game plan. They've been more or less playing this game time and again, like the Scottish nationalists in some sense, you know. Cameron said, no, let's go for a referendum. I'm not increasing your competences. And they were very surprised. They said, why? You know, would you risk this? We don't really want to exit, you know. We just want more competences. But Cameron was sort of like very blunt, you know. No, you take it or leave it. Either you go or you stay, but there is no devolution max. The Catalans, the center-right, they wanted to do this, you know, because, and they are right in saying that the Basque Country and Navarra, some other regions in Spain, they have a fiscal agreement which is much more, you know, beneficial for them. It's better in terms of fiscal autonomy. In the Basque Country, for example, you collect all your taxes, and then you just give a quota to Spain.
You negotiate that quota.
Yeah. So, and they got a point there. I said, look, you know, in the Basque Country, they have this sort of agreement. Why wouldn't we have something like this, you know? And say, well, because then you would have to revise the whole system, and in times of crisis, it's not a good deal. So the center-right started to play hard on independence with the expectation that they will bring the government to the table. But in the meantime, they realized that people actually, a lot of them believe this discourse and they wanted independence, you know. So now they cannot compromise anymore. Now even if the government would offer Catalonia a fiscal settlement, they will say, no, you are insulting me, you know, you want to buy me out, you know. This is not about money, this is about love. And I don't love you anymore, you know. So the way they've changed the discussion has led sort of both parties again in a situation in which you kind of split the difference. So if you come to the negotiation table and say, what can I give you so you would stay? And they say a referendum, so I can leave, and you would not block my EU membership and so on. So again, you know, it's a polarized situation in which the majority of Catalans who actually feel Spanish, European, and Catalan at the same time, they may be likely to force to choose between two things they don't want to choose. They don't want the status quo, and they don't want independence. But this third question is not on the table. And this is the art of sort of manipulating politics through direct democracy with referendum. That the important thing is the questions that you're never asked. You know, because if you pair in Spain, if you ask people in Catalonia, would you want the status quo or sort of what we call third way? People would go for the third way. If you ask people, would you want a third way or independence? They would go for the third way. But if you ask them, do you want independence or the status quo? They would go for independence.
Thank you. So are there anybody wants to ask any questions? Very well. So we're almost out of time. And so I would like I have one last question for you. The situation in Spain is that since the last elections, there's been a stalemate. Essentially 4 parties trying to figure out whether or not they could try to form a government with a majority in parliament. So far, and we're very, very, very far along now in terms of the constitutional timetable, it seems like no agreement is possible, and it looks very, very likely like elections are going to have to be repeated in the coming June. And the predictions are that those elections, that there will be some shifts in the electorate, that there may be a lower turnout, but that the result isn't going to be that different. So in the last 5 minutes or less that I have, what should we expect?
Well, that's, of course, you know that political scientists are very bad at predicting the future. I mean, most of the time we spend our time discussing, predicting the past, and what happened and why it happened and so on. So, this crystal balling thing is always very complicated, especially under present circumstances, because voters have not yet been anchored to the new parties. So we don't know, and parties themselves don't know what to make of the new situation. They have probably, when they look at the deeper trends, they have the understanding that things have changed structurally. That is, that what happened in December with the collapse of the main two parties is there to stay. That's probably something we are more or less sure about. In the last general election before the crisis in 2008, the two main parties had 83% of the vote together. So it was imperfect, but a two-party system according to for political scientists. In the last election, the two main parties had 47% of the vote, which means that a huge political market, was opened, and political entrepreneurs, either from the right or the left, could tap into that market and try to make attractive offers. And they were successful, as we saw yesterday. Spain is the country where party volatility has been highest in Southern Europe. Like almost 1 out of every 3 voters went for new parties in the last election, which is remarkable in terms of comparative politics. So we know that this has changed. It's most likely that has changed more or less structurally. Also because we see how young voters and the emergence of this new generational cleavage, this is something which is very hard to think that it will change. Young people so politics is now structured between social democrats and conservatives, very appealing to people older than 55. And then you have symmetrical sort of parties for young people or for people under 55, but also 35 mostly, both in the right or the left. And this is something quite new. It's very difficult to think that when you have not only a choice between left and right, but also generationally, you can identify with a party that you would not go precisely for that party, because in the past, you may dislike the Social Democrats now, but now you have a young leftist party. If you're among young voters, may be of course very tempted to vote for that. They look like them, right? And this is very important in politics, that the way that you vote for someone who looks like you, even aesthetically speaks like you, and all this. So we have like 2 old parties and 2 new parties along left, right, and along dimensions in both places. So this is likely to stay. But this said, we still don't know how it will play, first because of turnout. People may find that politicians have been wasting their time, and their time between December and now, and therefore they may stay at home. It's mostly young voters that tend to stay at home if they are dissatisfied. So that may have an impact. Then, for Podemos, a key question which you raised was, it is a party that needs to compete on with 2 different faces at the same time. Sort of this left wing, but also on the national question is not entirely clear. Mostly by surprise, they found themselves being very popular in Catalonia and the Basque Country and in places with different or distinct national identities. They did not expect this, because at the beginning they were going more for the sort of, let's reconfigure Spanish nationhood in unity around democracy, sovereignty, and social rights. And that's the offer, which will fit Catalans and Basques. So, Spanish nationalism does not fit there. But as time has moved on, and succession in Catalonia and independence and the referendum question has been more in the agenda, it's difficult for them to hold these sort of two balls in the air at the same time. And when the music stops, or maybe there are three balls, and then you will lose one, and they have to decide where do they want to go. You cannot please everyone at the same time forever. So it's not entirely clear how the nationalist question will play. But I think Podemos will still be strong, because the Social Democrats not only have a weak leader probably at this point, but also they have structural problems typical of social democracy across the continent, is that they are not popular anymore. They were in charge during the crisis. They didn't do well. They compromise all too easily, and so on. So this was a long answer to say, I don't know what is going to happen, as you realized.
All right. Well, we are out of time, so thank you very, very much, José Ignacio.
Thank you for your time.